One crisp autumn morning, Ethan Dawson sat on his porch, cradling a steaming cup of coffee, watching his cattle graze across the rolling hills of his ranch. The sky stretched wide and blue, the kind of morning that made him grateful for the quiet, open land he called home. The rhythmic swish of tails, the occasional lowing of cattle, the distant rustling of leaves, it was peaceful, uninterrupted, exactly the way he liked it. That peace lasted until he walked down to check his mailbox. Inside sat a thick envelope, its pristine white surface stamped with an official-looking seal, Winding Creek Homeowners Association. Ethan frowned. That was odd. His ranch sat a mile away from the nearest subdivision, separated by a tree line and a sturdy fence. He'd never been part of an HOA, and he sure as hell had never signed up for one. Maybe it was a mistake, some junk mail meant for one of those HOA folks in their manicured, identical houses. Still, something about the weight of the envelope set his gut on edge. He tore it open and skimmed the first few lines. His stomach twisted into a hard knot. Dear Mr. Dawson. As a valued neighboring property to Winding Creek, your land has been designated as community space under the Winding Creek HOA. Our board has voted to reclaim this land as a shared recreational area for our residents to hike, explore nature, and hold family outings. We request the removal of all fences blocking resident access. Compliance is expected within 14 days. At the bottom, signed in an aggressively cheerful flourish, was Karen Whitmore, HOA president. Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. This had to be a joke. They were claiming his ranch as if it were some vacant lot up for grabs. And the audacity, to demand he remove his fences? His jaw tightened. If this was some kind of sick prank, it wasn't funny. And if it wasn't? Well, Karen Whitmore and her little HOA were about to learn the hard way that Ethan Dawson wasn't the kind of man to roll over and comply. Furious, he stomped back to his truck, the letter crumpled in his fist. It was time for a little chat with this so-called HOA. Ethan's tires crunched over the pristine pavement as he pulled into the Winding Creek HOA clubhouse parking lot. The contrast between his dusty, hard-worked truck and the polished SUVs surrounding him couldn't have been more obvious. The entire place reeked of privilege, the kind that thought it could bend the world to its liking with a few signatures and a smile. He marched through the glass doors, immediately hit with the scent of expensive essential oils and the low murmur of polite but insincere conversation. At the head of a long, mahogany conference table sat Karen Whitmore, precisely as he imagined, blonde bob, pastel cardigan, a pearl necklace that screamed I ruin people's weekends for fun. Two other board members sat beside her, Jerry Calloway, a suit-clad man with the smug air of someone who spent more time golfing than working, and Maggie Thornton, whose pursed lips made it clear she hadn't smiled sincerely in years. Karen looked up, feigning surprise at his presence. Oh. Mr. Dawson, we weren't expecting you so soon. Ethan slapped the crumpled letter onto the table. Explain this. Karen barely glanced at it. Ah, yes. You must be thrilled. Winding Creek is an exclusive community, and your land has such wonderful potential. Our residents have long desired a space to connect with nature. This will be wonderful for everyone. Ethan folded his arms. This is my land. You don't get to just claim it. Karen let out a light, patronizing laugh. Oh, Ethan, no one is claiming anything. We're simply ensuring that land is used for the greater good. Our board voted on this last month, and you were notified. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Notified? You mean this letter? That's not how ownership works, Karen. Jerry cleared his throat. Mr. Dawson, you live just outside our official boundaries, which makes your property an extension of the Winding Creek community. Ethan nearly laughed. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Karen's smile remained fixed, but there was an edge to it now. This is a fair compromise. Our residents gain a natural retreat, and in return, your property value increases by being associated with Winding Creek. It's a win-win. Ethan clenched his jaw, biting back the urge to tell her exactly where she could shove her compromise. Instead, he exhaled sharply. Let me make something clear, this is trespassing. If I catch anyone on my land, they'll be removed. Legally. Karen's smile faltered for the first time. She opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan turned on his heel and strode out. He didn't have time for their delusional fantasies. But unfortunately, they didn't care what he had to say. A few days later, Ethan was out repairing a section of his fence when something caught his eye, a flicker of movement beyond the tree line. At first, he assumed it was a deer, but then he noticed picnic blankets. His stomach sank. Grabbing his binoculars, he scanned the field and spotted a family of 4, sitting in the middle of his pasture like they belonged there. The father tossed a football with his son while the mother snapped photos on her phone. But what made Ethan's blood boil was the little girl, standing way too close to Tank, his 2,000-pound bull, waving a granola bar in his face. Ethan dropped his tools and stormed across the field. "Hey," he bellowed. The father waved like they were old friends. "Oh, don't mind us. Karen said we could enjoy the open land." Ethan's patience snapped. "Karen doesn't own this land." "I do." The man gave him an indulgent smile, the kind people gave when they thought you were being difficult for no reason. "Well," she said. "I don't give a damn what she said. You had to climb over a fence to get here. That should have been your first clue." The mother frowned, crossing her arms. "We're just trying to enjoy nature." Ethan pointed at Tank, who was starting to get agitated by the girls waving. "That's not a cow. That's a bull. And if she keeps that up, he's gonna toss her like a rag doll." The father scoffed. "There's no need to be rude. We're just making use of community land." Ethan stepped forward, voice low and firm. "Let me say this one more time. This is not community land. This is my ranch. If I catch you here again, I'm calling the sheriff." Grumbling, they gathered their things, muttering about how unfriendly he was. As they disappeared back toward their fenced-in, manicured neighborhood, Ethan realized something. Words weren't going to be enough. If the HOA wanted to pretend his land was theirs, he was going to give them a very real reason to stay the hell off of it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat on his porch, staring out at his land. The fence he had spent years maintaining wasn't enough anymore. If they didn't respect boundaries, he was going to have to make them. The next morning, he called the county land office to ensure everything was in order with his property rights. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Karen hadn't just been trespassing. She had filed paperwork with the county, claiming part of his land as community green space. Ethan gripped the phone tighter. "You're telling me someone else, filed ownership claims over my land?" The woman on the other end sighed. "Technically, it's labeled as an unofficial reassignment, but yes. They argued it was unclaimed green space and included it under the HOA's jurisdiction. If you want to contest it, you'll need to file a formal dispute." Ethan's grip tightened until his knuckles turned white. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was theft. Karen Whitmore had just declared war. Ethan wasted no time. The second he hung up the phone, he drove straight into town, heading for the local farm supply store. If Karen and her self-important HOA thought they could steal his land with some fraudulent paperwork and a smug smile, they had another thing coming. He didn't just buy a few new fence posts, he bought reinforced, pressure-treated wood, industrial-grade wire mesh, and a top-of-the-line electric fence kit. Nothing dangerous, just a strong, legal jolt that would remind any trespasser, especially those who thought rules didn't apply to them, that his ranch wasn't some public playground. By the time he returned home, the sun was beginning to set, but he wasn't about to waste a second. As he unloaded the materials, his neighbor Roy Lancaster ambled over, hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn-out jeans, chewing on a toothpick as he watched Ethan dig post holes. Reinforcing the fort, huh? Roy mused, leaning against a fence post. Ethan smirked. Something like that. Roy let out a low chuckle. Can't say I blame you. HOA's been trying to sink their claws into anything they can. Hell, they once tried to fine me for parking my truck in my own driveway. Ethan shook his head. Unbelievable. Oh, it gets worse. They sent someone to measure my grass height. Claimed I was lowering property values by not keeping it trimmed like theirs. Ethan exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders as he set another post. That's exactly what they're trying to pull here. They reclassified part of my land as community space, tried to make it official. If I hadn't checked with the county, I wouldn't have even known. Roy's expression darkened. Damn crooks. He nodded toward the materials. That's why you're putting this up? Yep. They want to pretend my land is theirs? They're about to get a very real reminder of where their property ends. Roy grinned. I'd pay good money to see Karen's face when she figures it out. Ethan spent the next 2 days reinforcing every inch of his perimeter. Thick wooden posts, steel wire, and at strategic entry points, the electric fence. When the last section was wired up, he grabbed a pair of insulated gloves and flipped the switch. A satisfying snap echoed in the air as the current hummed through the wires. The fence was legal. It was effective. And best of all, it was Karen-proof. Or so he thought. The next morning, just as he sat down with his coffee, a furious pounding rattled his front door. Ethan didn't rush. He took his time, stretching, finishing his sip, before finally pulling it open. Karen stood on his porch, flanked by her ever-present lackeys, Jerry and Maggie. She looked livid, her pastel cardigan slightly askew, as if she had stormed out of a meeting in the middle of a meltdown. You can't do this, she shrieked, the moment she saw him. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, raising an eyebrow. Do what? She gestured wildly toward his land. That hideous, dangerous fence. It violates community aesthetic standards. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee. Karen, I am not in your community. She ignored him, crossing her arms. Electric fences are a public hazard. You are jeopardizing the safety of innocent families. Ethan's jaw twitched, but he kept his voice calm. You mean the innocent families trespassing on my land? Maggie shuffled uncomfortably, but Karen stood firm. This is about principle, Ethan. This land was meant to be shared. Ethan sighed, setting his coffee cup down. Let me break this down for you. This is my land. That means I decide who steps foot on it. You don't like my fence? Tough. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan raised a hand. And before you start spouting HOA bylaws, let me remind you, your rules mean nothing out here. Her face turned an alarming shade of red. With a dramatic huff, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her car, Jerry and Maggie scrambling to keep up. Ethan watched them go, expecting that to be the end of it. But Karen wasn't done. A few days later, an official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. When he opened it, his eyes narrowed. Winding Creek Homeowners Association, violation notice and fine. The letter claimed he owed $1,500 in HOA fines for non-compliant fencing, his electric fence. Unapproved livestock, his cattle, on his own ranch. Failure to maintain proper landscaping aesthetics, his pasture wasn't mowed to HOA standards. Ethan laughed. Not just a chuckle, a full, incredulous laugh. Karen was fining him for not following HOA rules, even though he wasn't in the HOA. His laughter faded as another thought struck him. If they were bold enough to find him, had they done this to other people? Digging around, he made a disturbing discovery. Several non-HOA homeowners on the outskirts of Winding Creek had quietly paid similar fines over the years, believing they had no choice. Karen had been extorting them for years. Ethan's grip on the letter tightened. If Karen wanted a fight, she was about to get one. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to take threats lying down, but even he hadn't expected Karen to sink lower than she already had. Fining him for imaginary HOA violations was one thing, he could laugh that off and shut it down with a good lawyer. But what she pulled next? That was war. It started with a visit from the county inspector. Ethan had been in the middle of replacing a water trough when he heard the slow crunch of tires on his gravel driveway. Wiping sweat off his brow, he turned to see a county truck pulling in, a man in a collared shirt stepping out with a clipboard in hand. The man gave him an apologetic nod. "Mr. Dawson, I'm here on behalf of the county. We've received multiple reports about your property being a," he glanced at his notes, "hazard to public safety." Ethan blinked. "A what?" The inspector sighed, clearly not thrilled about being here. "We had complaints about excessive dry grass, potential fire hazards, and concerns about uncontained livestock." He flipped the page, then hesitated before adding, "There was also a claim that some of your cattle may be diseased." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't even need to ask where these complaints had come from. "Let me guess," he said, arms crossed. "The HOA?" The inspector gave him a careful look. "I can't disclose that information, sir." That was as good as a yes. Ethan gritted his teeth. The fire hazard complaint was ridiculous, he regularly mowed and maintained his property. The livestock complaint was equally absurd, his cattle were all tagged, fenced, and fully accounted for. But the disease accusation? That one made his blood boil. If the county deemed his cattle a health risk, they could order a mandatory culling. It didn't matter if the claims were fake, if the wrong person signed off on it, he could lose everything. Ethan kept his voice steady, but his fists clenched. "You'll find everything in order. Let me show you around." He led the inspector across the ranch, pointing out his fire break zones, neatly trimmed fields, and healthy, well-fed cattle. The inspector took notes, checking off each section of his report. After an hour, he nodded. "Everything looks good to me," he admitted. "I'll file my report and mark the complaints as unsubstantiated." Ethan exhaled, but his frustration only grew. As the inspector climbed back into his truck, he muttered, "Between you and me, Mr. Dawson, this isn't the first time we've had to deal with HOA overreach from Winding Creek." He gave Ethan a knowing look. "They've tried to pull stunts like this before." Ethan watched the truck disappear down the road, his blood simmering. This wasn't just harassment. This was a coordinated attack. Karen wasn't just trying to make his life miserable, she was trying to destroy his livelihood. And she wasn't done. A few days later, a legal notice arrived in the mail. He ripped it open, expecting another bogus fine. Instead, his eyes narrowed as he read the header. Winding Creek Homeowners Association vs. Ethan Dawson. The HOA was suing him. Their claim? His electric fence and livestock were creating a public hazard and lowering community property values. Ethan leaned against his truck, laughing bitterly as he scanned the nonsense-filled pages. Karen wasn't just making complaints anymore, she was trying to drag him into court. He grabbed his phone and called his lawyer, Dave Callahan. The man barely made it through the first few paragraphs before snorting. "This won't even make it past the preliminary hearing," Dave said. "HOA has no legal authority over you. You're not in their jurisdiction, and they're trying to sue you over things you're legally allowed to have." "They're hoping I'll settle," Ethan muttered. Dave chuckled. "They don't know you very well, do they?" 3 weeks later, they walked into court. The HOA's lawyer stood confidently, arguing that Ethan's ranch was an unofficial extension of the community. He droned on about how residents had long enjoyed access to the land and that Ethan's recent hostile actions, i.e., keeping trespassers off his property, had damaged the neighborhood's peaceful atmosphere. When it was Ethan's turn, Dave barely had to speak. The judge flipped through the documents and raised an eyebrow. "You're suing a man for legally fencing in his own land?" The HOA's lawyer swallowed. "Well, Your Honor, if you consider the larger picture." The judge cut him off. Case dismissed. Karen looked ready to explode when the gavel came down. But even that wasn't the end. After the lawsuit fell apart, Karen tried a final, desperate move. One morning, as Ethan was feeding his cattle, another truck rolled up. A man stepped out, clipboard in hand, a county badge clipped to his shirt. "Mr. Dawson," the inspector said, "I'm here about a report of an illegal fence." Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. "You've got to be kidding me." The inspector exhaled. "Trust me, I already know what this is." He motioned for Ethan to walk with him along the property line. "I just have to check the paperwork and confirm your fence is compliant." Ethan showed him the permits, warning signs, and zoning approvals. The inspector checked a few boxes, then sighed. "Yeah, this is 100% legal." Ethan crossed his arms. "So, what happens now?" The inspector grinned. "Funny thing, you're not the only one I have to check on today." He flipped his clipboard, revealing another citation, this one issued to Karen Whitmore. "She's been fined," the inspector said, grinning, "for trying to enforce HOA rules outside of her jurisdiction." Ethan let out a slow whistle. Now that's poetic justice. That night, he sat on his porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. For the first time in months, it was quiet. No trespassers, no legal threats, no HOA nonsense. Karen had played every dirty trick in the book. And she had lost. Ethan thought it was over. The county had ruled in his favor, the lawsuit was dead on arrival, and Karen had been hit with a fine of her own. For the first time in months, his land was quiet again, no trespassers, no fake complaints, no HOA nonsense. But something still didn't sit right. Karen had spent too much time and effort trying to steal what wasn't hers. She wasn't the type to go down without a final, desperate move. And then, the last letter arrived. Unlike the previous threats, this one wasn't from the HOA, it was from a real estate company. Confused, Ethan opened it and skimmed the first few lines. It was an offer to buy his ranch. A damn strong offer. More than market value, with promises of a hassle-free sale and a seamless transition into a planned community expansion. Ethan stared at the paper, his blood running cold. Karen hadn't just been trying to control his land, she'd been trying to force him out. She had been setting up every complaint, every legal headache, every zoning battle to make his life miserable enough that he'd give up and sell. He called the number on the letter. A cheerful voice answered. "Oh, wonderful. Mr. Dawson, we were told you might be looking to sell." Ethan cut them off. "Who told you that?" A pause. Then, an awkward cough. "Well, the previous discussions with Ms. Whitmore indicated that the land might soon be open for acquisition." Ethan hung up. That was it. Karen had lost every battle, so she tried to cut a backdoor deal, assuming he'd fold. And when that failed? A week later, Roy showed up at his door, grinning ear to ear. "Guess what?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What now?" "Karen's out." Ethan blinked. "What?" Roy chuckled, pulling out his phone to show a screenshot of an HOA meeting transcript. "HOA board voted her out last night. Turns out, people got real sick of her wasting time and money on a fight she couldn't win." He laughed. "She's moving." Ethan exhaled, a slow, satisfied breath. No kidding. Oh, and get this, Roy added, smirking. Her house just hit the market. Ethan shook his head, chuckling. I should buy it. Roy nearly doubled over laughing. Now that would be poetic justice. He never did buy Karen's house, but knowing she was packing up and leaving was victory enough. She had spent months trying to control him, destroy his way of life, and force him out. And in the end, she was the one who had to leave. Ethan sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, finally at peace. No more HOA letters. No more trespassers. No more Karen. Just him, his land, and the freedom she had tried, and failed, to take from him. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that overstepped their boundaries? Or a Karen who thought she ruled the world? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.